Hi everybody and welcome back to the channel. Mr. McMahon, the Netflix documentary. We're going through a limited series here, reviewing episode by episode. So episode 2 this is right now, which is titled Heat. Of course, there will be some distressing topics that we talked about in this episode, so do be pre-warned. Vince McMahon did release a statement before this documentary series was released. I don't regret participating in this Netflix documentary. The producers had an opportunity to tell an objective story about my life, an incredible business that I built, which were equally filled with excitement, drama, fun, and a fair amount of controversy and life lessons. Unfortunately, based on an early partial cut I've seen, this doc falls short and takes a predictable path of conflating the Mr. McMahon character with my true self of Vince. The title and promos alone make that evident. A lot of misrepresented or left out entirely in effort to leave viewers intentionally confused. The producers are typically editing tricks with out of context footage and dated soundbites, etc., to distort the viewer's perception and support a deceptive narrative. In an attempt to further their misleading account, the producers use a lawsuit based on an affair I ended as evidence that I am in fact Mr. McMahon. I hope the viewer can keep an open mind and remember that there are two sides to every story. There are indeed two sides to every story, ladies and gentlemen, and obviously we will be basically discussing what everyone is claiming in this documentary. No facts are necessarily given on a lot of cases, a lot of accusations, and we are merely discussing and reacting to those claims that have been made. NXSteve, you're by me once again. Obviously, episode 2, there were a lot of haunting topics in this one that we are going to go into, but we do start off obviously with something that is well, Vince McMahon dancing, the stand back, very famous for a lot of people having a bit of fun with this back in the day, being used on WWE TV. Of course, Hogan on the guitar, Savage as well involved. But obviously 1985 and 1984, those 2 years, very pivotal in the wrestling era, and shows that blend between wrestling and entertainment. And obviously it works through to WrestleMania 2, which, let's be honest, is described as a bit of a shit show. They said they won't be doing this again because all their eggs in the basket of WrestleMania 1, Madison Square Garden made it work. How could they make it bigger for WrestleMania 2? They did 3 locations at the same time. The roster was split into 3, doing 3 different locations, and to be honest, they lost feed at places and couldn't connect to the shows very well. And I mean, just a personal opinion, I don't think the card is executed very well, but that's just my opinion being dosed in on something that's not really important for the documentary. However, one thing that is note, I think before WrestleMania 2, is Jesse Ventura wanted to start a union because wrestlers at this point after WrestleMania 1 have become mainstream, but you know, WWF was on the road at this point. It was a 7-day a week every week, and like I said, if someone got hurt, you didn't get paid. You know, you were just you wasn't given this lucrative contract where you were, you know, looked after if something happened. So you had to fight if you were hurt, and that led to a lot of painkillers, which is something that's an early note into this one.
Yeah, I mean, what's the famous quote? 7 days a week, twice on Sundays, I believe, is how many times a week they wrestled. And yeah, it's, I mean, just to skip on to how this all ends up winding out, it basically ends up with Hogan ratting out Ventura to Vince and saying that, hey, Jesse's trying to start a union. And then it ends up with Vince basically saying to the wrestlers, by all means, join Jesse if you want, but you'll never work for me ever again. And he kind of essentially just blackmails everyone out of joining the union, because obviously at this point as well, like you said, their schedule is heavy. There's no medical like a lot of jobs in America do. They offer health care and dental care and all that kind of stuff, which WWE just wasn't dishing out. And obviously with Jesse trying to start a union and trying to be a big advocate for that, Vince just quietly nips it in the butt before it ever becomes a thing.
Do you think, obviously, with the likes Hogan going behind, he said, like, I'm just giving Vince the heads up, but is it the fact that he's the top guy? And obviously there was talk about, you know, you don't want people going to Madison Square Garden and half of the roster walk out on your show.
Absolutely. Like, this is the problem with this time period with Hogan, is that we all kind of know from previous shoot interviews with many people that Hogan is kind of like in it for himself, and like he's the top guy. He's the guy that's making so much money. I mean, obviously we go on to touch about, well, they don't even really talk about Warrior in this, but obviously the infamous Warrior situation where Warrior ends up leaving the company shortly after, I think it's WrestleMania 6, isn't it? Because he tries to essentially blackmail Vince into giving more money, and it's just what it is. And Hogan being that top guy, he's just essentially looking out for himself, which I don't blame the guy, because I think anyone in that same situation would have done the same thing. But yeah, it's like it either works out one way. So either Jesse gets screwed over, or Hogan and the rest of the boys get screwed over. So you can kind of take it as Hogan's looking out for himself as well as the rest of the boys.
Yeah, it looks to be the case indeed. Then obviously the unionization didn't kind of work, and I believe it was Dave Meltzer said it'd be even harder to get one up today. Obviously, the journey of WrestleMania 1 got everything off the ground. WrestleMania 2 didn't quite work as the spectacle as what they wanted, but they needed to get things right for WrestleMania 3. And obviously, Vince had looked at the Superdome, which can hold up to 93,000 people in there, and said, we can do this with the right story, with the right build. We can make this happen. And someone had actually left the promotion to go and do some acting because he was banged up and needed surgery. It was Andre the Giant. Vince went to him and said, look, we can do this with you as a heel against Hogan. We need to make this work. And Andre agreed to get the surgery done, came back, made the build for WrestleMania 3 with Hogan, which of course felt like a big time deal. And they promoted all these things as well with Andre the Giant. Hadn't been beaten in 15 years. He'd lost matches. Hadn't been body slammed before. He'd been body slammed at least 25 times before. And Hogan was someone that's done that as well. But it was a big selling point for WrestleMania 3. And you know what? They did it. WWE obviously claiming they got 93,000 fans, one of the highest attended arena shows ever. And of course, Dave Meltzer came up with the claims that it's around about 78,000. I think it's an impressive feat either way. Some, though, did suggest that it could be blurring the lines, could be somewhere in the middle of the actual attendance, which is still one of the biggest controversies to this day. What was the attendance of WrestleMania 3, which is kind of fun. But going into the match itself, Hogan gets Andre. Hogan didn't actually know the plans going in. He claims that he didn't know if Andre was going to do the job and help him. They were just going to call it in the ring as it went on. And Hogan had said to Vince, have you spoke to Andre? And Vince said he'll do the right thing. I'm not sure I'm buying all of this bit here, but do you know what? It's been served to me. I'm going to entertain it. But it was called in the ring, and Hogan only knew he won when he pinned Andre's shoulders to the mat. But there was a moment where he said that Andre just screamed at him, slam! And that's when the slam was hit, followed by the leg drop. And that's what got the 1, 2, 3. And that propelled Hogan to super stardom.
Yeah, and going back to what I just previously said, like I genuinely feel this is probably actually how Hogan felt, because like he says, no one can touch Andre. Andre is like this beast. His hand is bigger than his hands are bigger than like 4 guys' heads put together. So it's not like you can tell Andre to do anything. It's kind of like Andre lets you do what he wants you to let him do. So I can believe that, again, this goes back to the point that Hogan is the main attraction. Like, he's worried that if he loses to Andre, does he lose his top spot? And again, he probably genuinely is worried about himself. So I can understand why he is terrified about Andre not doing the job. But yeah, I mean, just to touch on the fact that the whole, like, I think they said that Andre was in the UK filming The Princess Bride, and like, I recently read something yesterday about Andre alone, and like the struggles that he went through with his back, and like how they had to shoot some of the stuff when they were doing that film. It just sounds like how a guy put himself through that much torture is just insane.
And especially for this match as well, because Hogan said that he realized through the match how bad Andre's back was. The fact that if he went down properly, he couldn't get up again. So he always said, like, if you're going to fall or do anything, go into the ropes, because you got a chance of getting up again, because you're not going to pick that guy back up. You know, Andre was 500 pounds, was well over 7 feet tall. It was, you know, an impossible job for anybody at that point. But I suppose a lot of credit must go to Andre for coming in and doing the job, supposedly passing the torch, even though Hogan was meant to be the bigger star. But as we said, it propelled him to super stardom, and that's where it led to the calls potentially for Hollywood. Hogan wanted to entertain it, but Vince wanted to keep him, because I think, and this is where a lot of suggestions come in about the idea of like who created Hogan. You know, is the fact that it's all Vince's lines that's there, and Vince isn't really getting the credit, but Hogan's delivering the lines as well. He's the one that's getting the message across. It's obviously what's seen as the perfect tag team for that era.
Yeah, I mean, they say that it's like you can't have one without the other. So it's even Hogan says, he's like, Vince just tells me what to do and I go out there and do it. So it's kind of like they generally just needed both. They needed each other at that point in time to make themselves, well, for Hogan to make himself that big star, and for Vince to make the WWF at the time that big company that he needed it to be.
Absolutely. And of course, that way Vince went, well, let's do a movie together. I'll be there with you. So they went to a hotel for 2.5 days and wrote the script for what would be the infamous film No Holds Barred. Have you ever seen that film?
I haven't, but I do know of the famous line.
I have seen that movie, although I was very young when I saw that movie, and I can say it's not the best movie I've ever seen. And to be fair, in the documentary, they go on to say as well, it's not the best work that's ever been created. We do get to see the famous line, like you've mentioned there, in there. And, yeah, it's. I don't know if it's Oscar worthy personally, but still, it does keep Hogan. As Vince said, it delayed him from Hollywood for a little bit longer.
If you could name me a film that Hogan's in that's good, I'd be more impressed.
To be fair, yeah, I've not found one that I've enjoyed enough yet to put it in the light category. So there we go. But look, Hogan continues, and I think there's the question of how long does Hulkamania really live forever? When does it the point that it starts to tire? And Bruce Pritchard suggested WrestleMania 6 is that time that they would start to tire a little bit. The transition over to the Ultimate Warrior, who had just become seemingly more popular, was the Intercontinental Champion at the time, and Hogan even said himself it was more colourful, more bright. He had everything going for him. It was just a level up from Hogan with the intensity and with the charisma, but didn't have the passion, was the argument Hogan made. But still, he did the job, and you do get to see you did the job, Hogan, but barely. You kick out at 3.1. You don't kick out and just let it lay down for free. It's 3.1. Let's be honest, he's standing. And if you go and watch that, it is the most self-driven, looking after myself transformation of the championship you've ever seen. Hogan grabs that title and hands it over to Warrior. It's all about Hogan. It is nothing about Warrior when you go back to watch WrestleMania 6, and that's my opinion. I'm sticking to it. Yeah, anyway, back onto the point. Warrior, they said it just didn't work. It wasn't connecting the same, so they said we need to go back to Hulk. That's what we're going to have to do, and the way to do that is they say similar to what they did in the 80s. They looked at what was going on in the world, what can they grab, because that's what's going to connect people the most. There was issues with Iraq at the time, with the United States, and stuff with Kuwait as well. So they took military superstar Sergeant Slaughter, who was a babyface for that time, which was a good guy, made him a heel, which is the term for bad guy at that point, and they made him an Iraqi sympathizer, which of course, again, it's something that fits that time zone, but of course was very controversial and hit near to home. A lot of people were upset with this angle because obviously family members were going out to be a part of that war and stuff like that. So this didn't connect as well as what it did, say, I don't know, 7 years earlier when Hogan had won the title from the Iron Sheik. But instead, Hogan does win the title here from WrestleMania 7, but instead from that thunderous Raw, it's still kind of seen as a bit of a, okay, it's Hogan again, because again, fans are tired of Hulkamania.
Yeah, it's like, dude, don't get me wrong, Hogan was the guy that got me into wrestling, but even I can go back and sit and say that he wasn't the greatest wrestler in the world. And I mean, anyone who's ever seen the self-destruction of the Ultimate Warrior piece that WWE put out many years ago will know that there's many people that weren't really big fans of him as a person, and he was more business-driven than he was more money-driven than business-driven back then. But yeah, just to move on to the whole Slaughter thing, yeah, it's dude, man, they simply tried to do something that they'd done before and that worked, and would thought, oh, this will be fine, this will work again, and unfortunately, this time it just didn't play out that way.
No, it was distasteful. And for me, I don't know, even watching it as a child, I wasn't a fan of it. But that's just me personally. But yeah, I can understand that why they would have tried it again. But like they said, they went a bit too far with this one and moved away from that storyline quite swiftly afterwards. Yeah. But this is when we start to move on a little bit to more, I suppose, more sensitive topics in this video. So do be prepared that we're going to be talking about the steroids trial. We will be talking, unfortunately, about rape and paedophilia as well. Unfortunately, these topics do get raised in this documentary, so do be aware of that as we start into that. We'll start then with the steroids trial, George Saforian trial, prescribing anabolic steroids that builds muscles. He was the doctor of note for WWE, and of course, he would end up going to prison. Apparently, he had been prescribing and selling drugs, these steroids, to an up to 15 wrestlers, what I believe was quoted in the documentary. Of course, it wasn't necessarily illegal to take steroids at this time period when it was, but to be the one prescribing and then selling them is what made it illegal, allegedly. So yeah, I mean, George was obviously part of WWF at that point, and obviously then was taken away, and this is what led then into many discussions about steroids in the company. Obviously, Vince McMahon coming out and saying he had taken them but no longer does, to try and promote and protect the image of the company. Hogan went on to another talk show, which I believe was the Arsenal Hall show, which he was told by Vince McMahon to just tell the truth. But instead he decided to say that he hadn't taken them and wouldn't take them, which didn't lead to ultimate favors for the company moving forward.
No, because I mean, at that point, you get a load of wrestlers. I think even David Schultz is one that comes out and says that I personally injected Hogan with steroids, and it's kind of like this part is where it gets very clever, because if you look at Vince in here, he turns around and goes that, well, I never employed Dr. George Kazarian. He was appointed to us by one of the sports fitness boards from one of the states that they were in, and that was how he became involved with the company. And it's kind of like, okay, I can see what you've done here. You've automatically passed that blame off as in like, well, I didn't bring him into the company, which, yep, it's fine, fair enough. But again, like, this is your company at the end of the day, and you should know what's going on, really. And then the fact that not just wrestling, but loads of sports at the time, they're all coming under scrutiny for steroids and substance abuse. And it just becomes this big thing in the 90s that there were just so many people abusing and falling victim and hell, even dying to substance abuse, that it becomes this really massive thing. And the fact that I found it hard to believe, essentially, when Vince first turned around and says that he claims he told Hogan to tell the truth, but then Hogan even says that Vince did tell me to tell the truth. And I was kind of like, okay, so maybe Vince, like, do you know what I mean? There is damage limitations if you do tell the truth. I mean, don't get me wrong, there's parts in the later episodes that kind of make me conflict to that now. But I'm like, hey, damage limitation is what you can make of it. And if you can be honest and get away with saying that, yes, I did do it, but I don't do it anymore, just kind of like how Vince did, really, you really do save yourself the hardship in the long run.
Absolutely, yeah. And I mean, it certainly didn't do any favors then. Obviously, they would come to blows later on further with this, as you mentioned. But obviously, from this point onwards, Vince was also going to start a world bodybuilding federation as well. Had hired a load of people in, but he said that it wasn't really a smart idea, as pretty much everyone on that was on steroids, so it wasn't going to take shape. One name we can say that's been heavily referenced in this, and is a big name for this, is Phil Mushnick. He is someone that is a news reporter, because when it comes to the mainstream media, a lot of people wouldn't touch professional wrestling with a barge pole, thought it was beneath them, but he decided to dive into it. But as Vince described him, as digging against the company is what his role was, but seemed to be actually exposing a lot of the darker sides of pro wrestling if you look at it from the other side. Women got a lot of abuse in wrestling. Tony Atlas said himself, you wouldn't think a lot of people well of them, because women wasn't a safe place for them in the 80s, is a quote there from him. And of course, it does go on to say that Jimmy Snuka obviously was with a fan in 1983. Obviously, this is also a Dark Side of the Ring episode. We mentioned about the David Schultz one in episode 1 of our series here. This is also another one that's been brought up here with Jimmy Snuka, and a fan actually died in a hotel room, which actually a wrestling fan was a fan of Jimmy Snuka. They suggested the idea, didn't Vince McMahon make this go away? Obviously, not too much more was touched onto this topic, so hard to dive into it further, but was certainly something that was referenced. But your take, obviously, this is where this episode starts to get a little bit difficult to stomach.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, for anyone who's watched any of the Dark Side of the Rings, it's like, obviously the steroid trial is one of those episodes. The whole Jimmy Snuka thing is one of those episodes, because I believe initially he was acquitted, wasn't he, of any charges, and then they charged him later on in life in his like 60s, but he was too old to go to prison or something like that. And it's just one of them things. Like, I think the problem is, especially with like how wrestling is perceived in general in a like in just a world aspect, like people don't think it's such a big deal, and it's not. There's not as much controversy in it as what you think it is. But obviously, this guy Phil Mushnick just obviously had a knack for looking into it and finding all these dark things. And like the fact that Tony Atlas is the first guy in the documentary to say that loads of women, well, not loads, but like women were abused in the 80s, and then obviously to go on to Jimmy Snook as well. It's like, okay, we're getting into, like, we're only 2 episodes in now. Now we're starting to really touch on the sensitive stuff.
Absolutely, and obviously another sensitive topic that has been brought up as well was something that you and I have said we had no idea this was even a thing until we saw this in the documentary, was the Ring Boy scandal. Obviously, was ring announcer Mel Phillips was bringing in people to set up the ring with him and stuff, underaged minors, and they were abused as well when being brought in. Apparently, if they were not willing to be involved with this before and they were not hired. Brett actually, I believe, does go quote to say about said he's a paedophile. There are mentions then of Terry Garvin and Pat Patterson also being mentioned to be involved. We see an interview with someone called Tom Cole being interviewed on TV, saying that he was underage and had been abused, but a settlement was made. This led to Mel Phillips and Terry Garvin being fired, released from the company, never to work for World Wrestling Entertainment again. Patterson, though, actually resigned from the company, but would return a few months later. Vince was adamant that he was innocent in all of this, and he would return a few months later, but he had to go for now. He had to, the negative press for business, he had to leave, but he was to return later. Tony Atlas would go on to make another claim that he would touch his, what was the term? Was it his
Tony Atlas grabbed it. Tony Atlas claimed that Patterson grabbed his junk.
His junk. I thought, was it something like Pecker or something like that? He said.
Pecker, sorry. Yeah, apologies.
Pecker, yes. So, which they said, like, couldn't you do anything about that? And he said, well, no, he was the number 2 guy. Well, couldn't you talk to the number 1 guy, Vince? And he said, yeah, I'd get fired. There's no way. Patterson meant much more. And he said, was he protecting Pat? Well, no, he's protecting the business because Pat was number 2. He helped Vince creatively. He helped with, creating storylines and stuff like that. I mean, we do know outside of this, not mentioned in the documentary, Pat Patterson is the creator of the Royal Rumble match. He is someone that made that. So he obviously has been of good use to Vince McMahon and probably thought, and Tony does say, Pat Patterson is more valuable to Vince McMahon than I am. I just get fired.
Yeah, and I mean, the fact that Vince goes on to, like, obviously, because Patterson is openly gay at this point as well, which again in the 90s is a really rare thing for a man to be openly gay, and that Vince essentially says that Patterson would have been the victim of a gay witch hunt, which is the reason he essentially why he resigned, and Vince proclaims that Patterson was innocent to all of this, and yeah, I mean, even just listening to Tom Cole turn around and say that it was it Patterson was the one that he says that Patterson was the one that sexually abused him, and that Garvin propositioned him, and then to have it all be settled out of court. And it's kind of like, this is where we're starting to, like I said a minute ago, we get into the real gritty stuff, and it's kind of like he said, she said. You kind of have to believe. You kind of have to, well, you don't have to believe any of it really, but it's kind of like you have to take it with a pinch of salt. And then, like you said, that Patterson is essentially Vince's number 2 at this point, and Vince needs him more than anyone because he is half the creative team at this point. So you kind of like, it just puts these thoughts in your mind that it goes back to obviously the snooker thing. Obviously at the time, Vince needed snooker. So did Vince pay off any fines, or did he get snooker off of the allegations from his trial back in '83? And then, like you said, you go to this Patterson one, and this is where you start to, like, I mean, the Dark Side of the Rings really help with this, but you really start to think how is this guy really manipulative in the way he does stuff in trying to make sure that his business succeeds, and he's willing to go to these depths.
Absolutely. Obviously, it's a question that's also asked in the documentary series of, was Jimmy Snooker, helped in the situation by Vince McMahon. And obviously he's portrayed the idea of that business always comes first, even if there is a right or wrong. As long as the business prospered, that's what mattered. And almost at one point they do say in the episode, it's like, well, fans don't seem to care. It's like the fans have got the entertainment, so it doesn't seem to matter either way with the fan base, obviously. And speaking of someone that fans would then be familiar with, be the first ever female referee, which was definitions hot blonde referee, I think was the definition that was thrown the term in the episode. But her name was Rita Chatterton. Of course, she was the referee. They would show the Vince McMahon's talk show segment as well, having her on, and how she was there, and how we'd see more of her. But she would end up being a result of sexual abuse. She'd made the accusations towards Vince McMahon. Quite graphic details as well were shared as well, quite disturbing ones as well. I'll let you watch the episode to hear what ones they were, but she would then reveal those on the Gerardo Rivera show, which would then lead to Vince McMahon filing a defamation lawsuit, which he would later withdraw in 1994. And just to give an update on this, in 2023, during a temporary lift of the statute of limitations for alleged victims of the sexual offences in New York State, McMahon paid a multi-million-dollar settlement to Chatterton, but Vince does still deny any wrongdoing, which was, of course, the big caption that came at the end of episode 2 in the Netflix episode. But yeah, again, a really sensitive topic, again, very uncomfortable.
Yeah, and then the thing is he's not wrong in terms of the fans, because you got to think back to the time as well that their demographic they're aiming for is 18 to 39-year-old guys. A lot of them are really young. They probably are not in tune with as much when it comes to news and stuff like that. So half of them probably don't care about any of this stuff that's going on, because this is, bearing in mind, this is all being reported in times like in newspapers, like I think the New York Post is another one, and it's just like that payment paper is famously obviously a very higher class read, you know what I mean? Like business people will read that. So for your average fan, they probably don't care half the time about it. But then the fact that Phil Mushnick comes back and turns around and says that no one cared enough to investigate the claims, I don't know if I don't find it shocking, because I think it's something I expect with the time frame. Do you know what I mean? It's something. It's like you can kind of look at anything that was investigated back in the late 80s, early 90s, and like how police workers evolved over the years is kind of the same thing. That people again treat wrestling like it's nothing. So for him to turn around and say that no one cared enough, I can kind of believe it.
The thing is, as well, there is that question that's put forward in the episode as well. Did anyone not care to look a little bit deeper? It just felt like no one wanted to touch on this one, and it came across a little bit like, female going after rich businessman, which was the statement thrown out at the time. So yeah, it didn't get looked into any further. But obviously, this then moves the attention back then onto what they can go for, which was the steroid trial, obviously. And the idea was that that would kick in with Vince McMahon, who was basically charged after what happened earlier in the episode with the doctor that had been put in prison, if he was supplying steroids, telling superstars to go on to steroids. So he was taken in for that, and he would go on then to start the trial. And obviously just before the trial, he would have neck surgery, which would lead then to some question marks of if this was legitimate or if this was a kayfabe wrestling angle to garner sympathy. Because of course, a lot of the heels back in the day used to wear neck braces if they hurt themselves. We did see a clip of Bobby Heenan who was just meant to be unwell wearing a neck brace, which would be classic Bobby Heenan, to be fair. But yeah, I mean, I can see where the argument can be made of like trying to make it into a wrestling angle to try and gather sympathy, but he may have had a legitimate neck surgery. It's hard to know.
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, I think the thing that I have to kind of give props to Vince here about is that he wasn't afraid of confrontation. He was willing to face everything head on, in terms of like, I don't really want to say it was in case of that he knows he can get away with it. It's more a case of that if he thinks he's done nothing wrong, he's not afraid to confront it. And it touches more on in the next episode when we go to do it, but the fact that he says that at no point did he ever tell any wrestler to take steroids, which is why like you can feel that he had the bravado and the general cojones to just like generally challenge it and take it to court. And I mean, we all know about how neck braces work in professional wrestling. Dude, take it for what it is. But for me, that neck brace is a little bit too loose for me for someone who's just had neck surgery. Like the fact that you can probably get your fist in down the side of it doesn't look that convincing to me.
Fair enough. And obviously the finish of the episode obviously goes on to discuss Hulk Hogan. Of course, Hogan, like we said, Hulkamania had been the star throughout the 80s, and people were growing tired of Hulkamania. Of course, he did leave the company in 1992 when just before WrestleMania 8 was his retirement match with Sid Justice. And obviously he was going to go on to Hollywood at that point because Vince, I suppose, would believe he could build new stars. And obviously this was a moment where Hogan then would go and join the competition because of the fact that when you look at it, Eric Bischoff was trying to make WCW a thing, and I think we go for a bit of a comedic thing of trying to see them do what was trying to do anything resemblance of what WWF was doing at the time, where we see the clips of RoboCop and Oz and all those classic sort of things. It's just as a package put together is actually slightly humorous actually, but to know that they could try and make competition and bridge the gap because they were the number 2 wrestling promotion, although it's Eric's words, might as well have been 202. That's as big of the gap as it was. But to talk to Hogan and say, look, we'd love to have you on board when on set of Trouble in Paradise, even if it's a limited dates, we'd love to have you on. And Hogan was all ears, and to think then he could have a guaranteed contract and work limited amount of dates, where it could be like 30 dates a year, guaranteed money, just suited Hogan and his family better. And of course he would then sign the dotted line and join WCW, which of course really hurt Vince at the time, but of course then goes into a bit of further detail for episode 3.
Yeah, and I mean, what was the reason for him leaving WWE? Was it because I can't remember? We said, was it money that he just couldn't afford to pay him, essentially?
I mean, I can't remember the entire reason. I know that Hulkamania was dying off, and I think Hogan pretty much said, like, you know, he needed to have time away. He needed to have a break.
Yeah, the only thing I noted from this is that Hulk claims that the steroid trial was one of the factors into him leaving WWE, because obviously he'd been given he'd just been given immunity from being prosecuted if he was supposed to go up against Vince. And obviously these two had been working together now for like 10 years at this point, and they're kind of close. I mean, they've made each other a butt ton of money, and it's kind of like, this guy's done everything more for me to put me in this position, but yet now I've got to go against him in a trial for steroids. And then, like I said, we'll talk about more in the next episode, but that was the one thing I couldn't remember them saying why the actual reasons I think he leaves WWE. But obviously it just goes on about money and the amount of money that Ted Turner was throwing at pro wrestlers as well. And it was just ridiculous. And like, obviously Ted Turner being like the media mogul that he was when he can't with CNN, TNT, I think CBS is the other one. So, I mean, he's got money to throw around, and he's obviously a big advocate for wrestling at this point as well. So, like you said, the fact that they got Bischoff going to Hogan saying, look, if you want to do this, and Hogan's like, yeah, I definitely want to do it, because he was bored of sitting in trailers all day doing nothing. Like, you can't blame him for doing it.
Absolutely. And it was also stated as well, like, well, there may not be a company of WWF to go back to if Vince is found guilty. True. So you never know the future for it. And if it's better for the family, better dates. I think as Vince himself said that, actually, look at it, you couldn't really blame him for doing so. But one thing I do remember Hogan said, it went from signs of Hulkamania and Hulkamania lives forever, actually turned then to, if you're taking your shot yet, it's stuff like that, a damaging of the reputation with the steroids trial.
That's right, yeah.
Him leaving, so that was the factor with that one there. But obviously then the big match then would be set for Hogan versus Flair, which would start to turn the tide a bit for WCW. But that's pretty much how it rounds off for episode 2, unless I've missed any details.
No, dude, I mean, that's pretty much where I got it. Was obviously like the thing was like the important thing for me with this one was that Hogan claims that they essentially blackmailed him and he had immunity. But then the fact to have Meltzer turn around and essentially confirm that he was granted immunity, I thought was good to know as well.
Yeah, I mean, when you have more than one person saying it, it kind of just adds a bit more weight to the, I suppose, opinion allegation that's been put forward, adds a bit more strength to it. So, and obviously it does
especially
come
with
into
the
it.
fact that especially the fact that Hogan is obviously the WWE guy I worked with Vince for years, and it's Dave Meltzer of all people, someone that's had no affiliation with the business.
Absolutely, indeed, yeah, 100%. But this one, I mean, obviously, again, it's very hard hitting. There are some very difficult moments in it, but certainly, I think at this point, it's a documentary that it's must see, is what I'd say to people at this point. Up 2 episodes in, and obviously, at the time of recording, you've seen 4 episodes, I've seen 3. So, it's we've not turned the channel yet. We're probably going to dive through this one quite quickly.
Yeah, totally, man. Like I said, I'm trying to avoid social medias because I've already seen a spoiler for an episode I haven't seen yet, and I'm kind of like, I want to take in from a first-time view, and I don't want to have to see something and then be like, do you know what I mean? I want to take it all in as it comes to me, as they've delivered it. And like from what I got, the first 5 episodes are basically going to be everything they recorded up to 2022, and I think the last episode is kind of everything after 2022. So, like I said, aside from the one spoiler I've seen, it's going to be interesting to see what happens.
Absolutely, indeed. And we'll be here to review the other episodes. You can check out episode 1 already. If you haven't seen it, make sure to go and do so. And we will be reviewing the rest of the series. And of course, if you're watching this later than the day it's been recorded, episode 3 probably is already on the channel for you right now. But thank you all for watching. Look after yourselves, hit the like button, share with a friend, and subscribe. And we'll see you for the next one.